300 kilometers southeast of here, with a surface area of 13 square miles. Our keynote this morning, Zoe Lucas, is a researcher and naturalist who studies the island and its wildlife. Zoe first went to Sable Island in 1971 as a university student, fell in love with the island, and eventually made it her home. She has lived on Sable Island for over 30 years. Now, Sable Island is the foggiest place in Canada, next to St. John's, Newfoundland, which is next to Halifax, Nova Scotia. To unravel some of the beauty and mystery of Sable Island, please welcome Zoe Lucas.
Thank you very much. As you can see, I have to bring a glass of water with me because I'm clearly used to fog and I need the moisture. What I'm going to, I'm not going to give you a talk so much about, a straightforward talk about the natural history of Sable Island. It's not, Sable Island through the seasons or Sable Island flora and fauna, bugs to horses. This is more about experiencing Sable. So it's, I have actually a lot of images, and I'm going to try to get through this in the allotted time. I gather that there will be a flashcard alerting me to running out of time, which is going to be helpful. So this is an aerial photograph of Sable Island, and I've spent, since I went there in 1971, about 40 years working on the island. So I went to the island, and everything I'm going to talk about here could actually, if you broke it up and gave it its own talk, you could sort of pretty much speak about an hour on every subject. So this is really skimming the surface of what Sable Island is about. But I went to the island in 1971 for a very quick visit. All I wanted to do was to see the horses. I was very keen on horses. I was attending the art college. I had no interest in Sable Island otherwise, and I knew nothing about it. And I managed to get a free seat on a flight going out with a journalist. And so it was just, I was only going to be there for a few days. And after spending most of my adult life on Sable Island, it's still a bit of a surprise. Oh, well, that photograph that I just showed you, this is my first flight to Sable Island on a small Piper Aztec, and carrying about 6 people. So when I got to the island, the first thing that happened was that I realized that my focus really wasn't on the horses anymore. The horses were so much a part of this magnificent, incredible, sweeping, captivating landscape that it was the landscape that enthralled me, and wandering around, learning for myself, discovering for myself, because that's what this whole Sable thing has been. It's been a process of discovery. Looking at the way dunes evolved, the way they eroded, and the way new dunes developed. Now, when I came to this, I actually brought a pointer because I thought I'd be pointing to a screen, but that's obviously not going to happen. So you can see in the background there's a high dune that's in the stage of eroding, and then in the foreground there's all these embryo dunes. So throughout Sable Island, like any beach on the mainland, that's allowed to continue, allowed to have its natural processes, that you'll have a very dynamic situations of dunes collapsing and new dunes forming as the old ones collapse. And walking inland, wandering about, exploring, discovering the ponds, and again, the horses just being a part of this incredible landscape. And sometimes you sort of feel like you're living in a watercolor painting because of the very horizontal nature and the soft colors, because of all that fog that we supposedly have on Sable Island. Realizing that there was much more to Sable Island than horses. The nesting birds, so this is a photograph that shows you the largest nesting bird on Sable and the smallest. The black-backed gull is the largest gull in the world. It's got a wingspan of 5.5 feet, or that's 1.6 meters, so it's a huge gull. The Ipswich sparrow is one of only 2 songbirds that actually nest exclusively in Canada. And the only place it nests in Canada is on Sable Island. And that photograph is a bit out of proportion because if you, that little bird is actually about the same length of that gull's head. So in addition to gulls, there are terns, storm petrel, shorebirds, and ducks nesting on the island. And in addition to those that nest, many birds are coming and going. Some of them normal migrants, spring and fall migrants, and other ones getting lost, being swept out to sea and finding temporary sanctuary on the island. And because there are there's only 1 tree on Sable, and it's only 50 centimeters high. Because there are no woodlands on the island, birds are far more visible. So if you're a birder, it's terribly exciting because all these little birds that are used to being in trees are kind of scampering around, sitting on twigs, bits of driftwood, and very easy to see. The vegetation on Sable can be very lush. It's frequently portrayed as being rather bleak and windswept, but that's mostly just in the winter. In the summer and in autumn, there are fields of wildflowers and grasses and heath plants. And it's not just a visual, but you can smell it as well. For instance, the wild roses. In any kind of light wind, the scent of the roses drifts over the dunes. And then later in the summer and in the fall, the island has its own version of fall colors. And, excuse me, the woolly yarrow, which is the brown plant in the middle, and it produces this wonderful spicy scent that dominates the scentscape of the island. And then there are the edible experiences. So these are the cranberries on Sable Island. In the old days, in the life-saving station days, they exported about 300 to 400 barrels off the island every year. And I have myself continued to collect berries, of course, up until it became a national park. I don't do that anymore. But I collected the berries. Instead of collecting them in the fall, when they are usually harvested, I collected them in January, February, and March, when they were ruby red ripe and pulsing with flavor and sweet. Just a little softer, though, which is why I guess people collect them in the fall, because it's easier. And, of course, made cranberry sauce and cake. And I can say that I collected so many in the past that even though it's now a park, I still have a few jars of sauce stashed in my freezer. So after 1971, I was desperate to get back to Sable Island, not to see the horses, just to be part of the landscape and to be there. And instead of having been to Sable for a quick visit and getting on with my other life, this did become my life. So I managed to get a job with a seal research group from Dalhousie University as a volunteer cook. It wasn't that I was a trained cook, but they were all too disinterested in cooking to do it themselves. So on the right side of the screen, that's the kitchen in the A-frame where I did my cooking. And since I had a lot of time in between cooking, I started working with the project, catching seals and trailing along behind Henry James, taking notes as he was taking compass bearings on seals' tracks. So there are two species on Sable Island that breed there. The harbor seals, they have their pups in May and June, but they've been in decline for years. And they peaked in the 1980s, producing about 600 pups a year, and now they're down to fewer than 20. That's partly because of a high rate of shark predation on these seals, and also competition with the other seal on the island, the gray seals. This is a harbor seal, mother and pup. Sorry. For those people who, that's cute, right. All right, moving on. So gray seals, they are a bigger, uglier seal overall. The male gray seal, which is the one in the back, is twice the weight of a harbor seal. So they're big seals, and the difference between the males and females is quite obvious, with the males having a big, ugly snout. They're called horseheads, and being darker. And the females having a generally lighter coat, and the pups are born with a white coat, whereas the harbor seals that we just saw, they also have a white birth coat, but it's shed in the uterus just before they're born, so that harbor seals are ready to go into the ocean right away with their mother, whereas the gray seal pups stay on the land and nurse until they put on some weight. The gray seal colony on Sable Island is the biggest gray seal colony in the world. And as you can see from this photograph, the gray seals come inland. They don't have their pups just on the beach, but they climb up on the dunes, go into the ponds, and everywhere on the island. And this happens during December through January. So the island is just one huge gray seal, seething with gray seals everywhere. The little indicator in the background shows you, it points to a herd of horses. So that kind of gives you a sense of the scale, both the sense of the scale of Sable Island, but also the scale of this gray seal colony. When you have so many of one species in one area, you start to have an opportunity. It becomes more likely that you're going to see anomalies, particularly some genetic anomalies. In this case, an albino gray seal. So this is an adult albino sleeping next to a gray seal of an adult of normal body color. And then the insets at the bottom show a few details. But the fact that this is an adult albino indicates that these albino seals can survive in the wild. And this is a second photograph of a juvenile albino seal. And I was traveling along the beach, and many discoveries on Sable Island are just being in the right place at the right time. And if you're working there on something else but still watching and observing, there's all these wonderful experiences that are learning and discovery experiences. And here was this young seal swimming along the beach, going the same direction I was at that particular time. And I watched it as it dove just below the surface and came up again. And every time it was just below the surface on this brilliant sunny day, the sunlight shone on the back of this light-coated seal, and rays of sunlight just burst up out of the water. And it was one of those images that, had you seen that maybe 300, 400 years ago, it would have given rise to legends and mythologies about the wonderful white seals, the magical white seals of Sable Island. Anyway, so because I was on Sable Island working on the seals and working with the Henry James crew, I also became involved in terrain restoration and was able to take over management of one of the first of the terrain restoration programs on the island. We did a wide range of work, but this is one in particular to give you an example of both damage caused by human activities and how these terrain restoration programs work. So the channel you can see cutting across the island was caused because in the old days, vehicles were driven back and forth across the dunes to get to one side of the island to the other. So we're looking at the north side of the island. As I'm sure you all know, which I didn't explain, but of course Sable is a long sandbar. The ends are east and west, and so you've got a long north beach and a long south beach. So we're looking at the north side there. This was a very serious cut. In the winter it became filled with water, and the rushing water was scouring this cut wider and wider, which could have resulted in actually cutting. It was serious enough that it could have cut the island in half. So our first task was to gather debris, anything, as the lower photograph shows, that we could use, stuff we found on the beach, old drums, old freezers, anything we could fill with sand to build a robust dike. The idea was to stop the water from flowing through this channel. It didn't work. As you can see, then in that fall, the South Beach is that big area covered with water. And that's normal. That happens every year. It happens after every hurricane. What isn't normal is that water rushing across to the north side of the island. So the photograph on the left shows, this is taken at the same time, and it shows the water has filled the channel again, and the dikes are flooded. However, the photograph in the lower right shows what happened the next spring. Because the dikes were there, they tipped, but they stayed in place, so they were well built. But what happened was, as the water was flowing through, the dikes slowed the water down, so any sand it was carrying started to drop into the channel and to fill the channel. And in the meantime, we started experimenting with transplanting beach grass from healthy areas into dune restoration areas, and worked out ways that we could have a large amount of success with about a 90% survival rate. So these 4 photographs show this particular site. So at the upper left, after a couple of years with the dikes still in place, the channel is a little bit wider, but also the sand level has been increased. Then we could start transplanting, as you can see in the upper right. And our transplants started themselves to collect sand. In the lower left, the transplants are starting to propagate. In the lower right, you can see how after a few years, the cut is now self-repairing. And this is what it looks like now. So the lower right shows you what it was, what we were working with. The overall photograph shows how terrain restoration can be tremendously successful, particularly if you start working with natural processes and using vegetation. So horses. If you're going to be working with vegetation and interest, so basically because of everything else I was working on, it comes around back to horses again. And although the horses weren't my primary focus in terms of why I wanted to be there, they were a focus because they are a very important component of the island's landscape and its ecology. And one of the first projects I became involved in was collecting horse manure, which could be used to measure parasite burdens in horses, and it could be used to monitor pregnancy rates. And this is non-invasive work, so you didn't have to handle the animals or take samples from the animals themselves. You could use the horse manure to measure for parasites, looking at the number of eggs of parasites per gram of feces. And for pregnancy, you could measure the estrogen levels in the feces, and that would tell you whether the female was pregnant or not. I calculated, based on the number of samples I collected over the 10 years that I worked on this, and that I carried over that time, about 6,000 pounds of horse manure in my backpack in total. It didn't seem like it at the time, of course. And the other thing that I discovered is that it takes about 4 hours, it can take 4 hours for a Sable Island horse, and this might be true of any horse, to produce a fresh sample. So, however, I also learned that if you come upon a group of horses who are snoozing, or just basically reclining, relaxing, when they stand up, they'll almost all produce a fresh specimen. So it was a great treat to find your target band all snoozing, because then I could sort of sit there and read a book and wait for them to stand up. And then it was a bit of a panic, because you didn't want to get you wanted to know where each sample was, because I needed to know which horse it came from. And you also didn't want them to step on it. So the way to make the most out of this survey was to keep track of the individuals, so that you weren't just sort of randomly collecting manure, but you were collecting samples from the same animal over a long period of time. To do that, I started keeping records, life history records, on individuals from the time they were born until the time they died. And this is an example. The foal in this photograph, Jem, grew up to be a band stallion, and that's him in the upper right. And as a band stallion, he had a fight with another stallion, and he was blinded in one eye and was mildly injured. But even as a stallion with only one eye, he ended up having a long career as a band stallion, and had some of the largest bands on the island. So I don't know whether he was, in being blind in one eye, was compensating in terms of just his postures and his attitude, but he was certainly fairly successful. So the horses on Sable Island, again, in summer and fall, the vegetation is abundant, and they spend the summer and fall putting on weight in preparation for winter. And as the winter approaches, they all start, their hair, they start developing a thick woolly coat. And the younger the horse, the thicker the coat, which kind of makes sense, because the younger the horse, the less body mass they have, the faster they'll lose heat in the winter. But these winter coats on these horses has led to some very unflattering descriptions of the horses being big-headed, donkey-like animals, but they're not deformed horses, they're just cozy horses. So the winters on Sable Island are nowhere near as severe as the winters on the mainland. The island doesn't get as much snow, not as much ice, and doesn't get as cold. The only challenging weather factor on Sable at any time of the year is the wind. When we do get snow on Sable Island, the horses are able to continue grazing. They will push the snow away with their noses or their hooves, or just go to an area where the wind has been strong enough to sweep snow off the vegetation. But there are many periods in the winter when there is a lull in the wind, and the horses can rest and take a break, soak up the warmth, and sort of generate a nice manure sample. So in the spring, horses are born. This is a very young foal, and you can see behind it there's some beach pea just beginning to come up. That's a very important forage for the horses. And this is one of the last foals born in Jem's band. He lived to 15 years of age, which was kind of a normal age for a sable horse. They don't live as long as domestic horses, but you can't really compare them because domestic horses don't live natural lives. They are given drugs, their teeth are attended to, their feet are attended to, they get specialized food. The Sable Island horses are a wild animal, even though they're descended from domestic horses. So while that does sound like kind of a short lifespan, it's not a bad lifespan for a wild horse. And some of them have been known to live up to 20 years of age, but 15 to 16 is normal. So Jem, as a band stallion, looking a little old now. This is in his last year, and he's got the sort of the classic sign of an elder horse on sable, which is the crest of the neck starts to lose some muscle, and it gets a bit of a droopy neck. This is a photograph of him walking along with the last members of his band. So that's Jem. He lived for 15 years, and so that kind of life history becomes incredibly valuable because. What we have with this animal is we know where he was during his life from foal to adulthood, what his social status was, what his reproductive record would have been. We have his, and then, of course, once they die, collect tissues, genetic tissues, and the skulls. When the horses die, it's sometimes they will die on the beach where they get buried by sand, sometimes more often in vegetated areas, and they get returned to the island very quickly. They're buried and they disappear, the bodies disappear, or else where they die on the dunes, and all the extra nutrients going into the sand causes great burst of vegetation. And it's quite often that you see a body of a horse this horse would have been dead only for a few months and is already beginning to melt back into the environment. And then those that survive the winter start putting on weight again. And as you can see, they're in gorgeous condition. They're as good as anything in terms of condition that you would see on the mainland. This is another band stallion. He lived to 16 years of age. So because I was traveling back and forth so much on the beach, tending to the horses, going from one end of the island to the other, I started paying attention to the beach birds, the bodies of birds washing up on the beach, to look to see whether they were entangled or oiled or what was going on with them. And then I realized that I should be doing regular surveys. And so I started that in 1993. And I was doing it 10 to 11 times a year, so over a 22-year period. And what I ended up looking for was oiled seabirds. So this was an opportunity to monitor the rate of oiling of seabirds in our region, in the Northwest Atlantic. And when I started, the oiling rate, that would be the proportion of birds oiled in the total number of birds I found, was up around 60% to 80%. And when we had lab work done on the oil samples, it turned out that it wasn't bilge so much and it wasn't fuel so much. It was mostly coming from crude oil. It was coming from tankers, which was a bit of a surprise. But the good news is, and this is and again, this makes staying in one place and continuing programs for a long period of time, and you get to see these patterns, that the oiling rate started to decline, particularly during the past 8 years with one little blip there. The oiling rate has been down below 10%, and in some years it's been 0. And this is because there's been a great deal of success in prosecution of polluters and better surveillance of shipping, but also better education of captains and crew so that they really know why this is such a serious issue, and better technology, greatly improved technology such as double-hulled vessels and better mechanical technology that reduces the amount of routine losses of oil. So this study, although this was measuring chronic oiling, not really oiling caused by major catastrophes like the Exxon Valdez, but actually the amount of oil in the ocean that we have coming from chronic losses, just day-to-day operations, greatly exceeded the amount of oil getting into the ocean from the big high-profile catastrophes. So this is sort of a good sign. However, with litter, not so much. All kinds of garbage washes up on the beach on Sable. Everything that you could possibly imagine floating around in the ocean and getting into the ocean you find on the island, including medical supplies, as you can see in the lower right. And plastics are increasingly dominating the amount of litter that comes ashore. When I first started looking at litter, there was a lot of glass, a lot of fish net, a lot of fishing gear. And now there's much more household products and industrial products, but most of it's plastic of some kind. And the plastic breaks up into smaller and smaller pieces. The bird in the lower right is a northern fulmar, one of the, and I find these birds in the bird surveys as well. And frequently they're dead, but they're not oiled. Now they could be dying of various causes, old age, for instance. But of the 300 corpses, fresh fulmar corpses that I collected, we found that 72% of them had stomachs filled with plastic, which you can see in the lower right photograph. And so fulmars can be used as sentinels. They're considered as a sentinel species. So because they feed far at sea and they pick their food off the surface of the ocean, they're very susceptible to picking up bits of plastic and swallowing them. So continuing to monitor the stomach contents of these birds gives you an idea of trends in the ocean, of the amount of plastic that's polluting the global ocean. Plastic and debris getting up on Sable Island has occasionally caused some problems for horses. This is a young female who managed to jam her front foot into a styrofoam net float. This doesn't happen too often, but it did break away. She wasn't limping, and so it didn't do any damage. It was on her leg for about a year, but it was still kind of loose, and it eventually just broke off. One of the litter items that I paid attention to mostly, like for a long period of time, has been latex and mylar balloons that get into the environment. And here you can see many of the balloons will have identification on them because they're used for advertising. They're frequently used for things, though, like raising money for charitable events and education. Universities release balloons, and it's not just from balloon releases, but any event where you give people balloons or have balloons tied to decorate your facilities. These balloons get into the environment. The interesting thing is that and in fact, about 85% of the balloons that turn up on Sable Island actually come from the U.S., from continental U.S., some as far away as Ohio. This has actually declined, though, and the number of balloons, we find balloon pollution on the island. And balloons cause a problem in the ocean because they're ingested again. The fragments are ingested by marine organisms, and birds get tangled up in the feathers. But the numbers have declined, probably not so much because there's been a real understanding of how bad these things are, but because the cost of helium is increasing dramatically, and it's becoming scarce. And so not having helium is solving this problem for us. But a couple of examples of some balloons that I found on Sable. This balloon had been, if you can read that little note, it was released on March 31st by a school in, where was it? I can hardly read, Ohio. And I found it 3 days later. Well, 2 days later. So it had traveled very quickly to Sable Island, and it would have been a release with a large number of balloons. One of them turned up on Sable, the rest of them probably ended up in the ocean. Unlike this one, which came from Indiana. And when I find any information, like a note or something attached to a balloon, I'll usually write to the people who sent it, not nagging them about not releasing balloons, but just giving them some background information so they can conclude for themselves that it wasn't a good idea. But this was a family that on Halloween night in Lafayette, Indiana, this family wrote their information on a disc. They attached it to a balloon bundle, just the one. Just the one. It wasn't a whole release. It was just the one balloon, the one disc. They let it go, and it ended up on Sable Island. It traveled over 2,000 miles, and that would be a straight line. That doesn't sort of account for the gyres and the twists that were taken in the atmosphere, and that landed on Sable Island. So in addition to looking at litter and the other things that turn up on the beach, Sable Island is this incredible platform for monitoring what's going on in the ocean out there in the Northwest Atlantic because it's so far from land. So for instance, finding things that you actually, things that you don't know are happening normally, but for instance, in the upper right, the Portuguese man-of-war, we'd normally see 10 of them washed up on the beach on Sable. But then there were years when we were seeing thousands of them washing ashore. And these kinds of events tell you something about circulation in the ocean and changing circulation and changing temperatures and whatnot. So keeping track of these sorts of events long term, although they're not a rigorous scientific research program, there's still basic monitoring that tells you something about the environment. And other surprises, for instance, one morning a bunch of debris, bits of driftwood and bits of plant that had been floating in the ocean washed ashore, covered in live ladybugs. So these ladybugs basically rafted to the island. It's quite likely that a whole whack of ladybugs were sort of blown off the mainland and came to rest on debris in the ocean. Many of them probably would have just landed in the water. But this gives you an idea of how beetles can fly, but this gives you an idea how various invertebrates might sort of travel from one place to another that you wouldn't expect. This many, I mean, there was tens of thousands of ladybugs stretched along the beach on this debris, so certainly if they hadn't been on Sable already, they certainly would have arrived on this particular day. So another example, since I don't have my pointer, in the upper right of this landscape, can you see a very, very small patch of yellow? Okay, so this is an example of those things that happen that are, again, like the albino seal in the water, just fleeting moments, opportunities of discovering something that actually is quite significant. And this was, I was standing on the dune working with some horses, the light was perfect, the time of year was perfect, and I noticed that yellow spot. And because once you're used to patterns, if you stay in a place long enough and you start to see patterns, both patterns, visual patterns and timeline patterns, you very quickly start to notice when something's different. And so I walked towards that, and as I got closer, I realized that this was a species of fern that has never been recorded on Sable Island. It's not a species of fern that could have gotten there recently. It had to have been there all along. And for all the surveys that have been on Sable Island, beginning in the early 1900s, this species has never been recorded. But if I hadn't been on that dune, in the right position to see the light glowing through the fronds of this fern, I might have been, walking within 100 meters of it, day after day and never noticed it. But these small accidents, again, not a part of some kind of planned research project, these small accidents still contribute to a better understanding of the Sable environment. It increases the number of species in its biodiversity list, and it encourages you to pay more attention to odd colors turning up in the landscape. So the same thing happens in this case. We found during the last couple of years, we've found 70 additional invertebrates, insects on Sable Island. Just because we've been looking, I've been paying attention to invertebrates just when I've been working on other things. And when I see something, I collect it. And then we take it back to the Nova Scotia Museum and get them identified. And again, we're working along the beach, being very used to the colors of the beach pea and the beach grass and the various other plants that are native there, suddenly coming upon this oyster leaf, this bluish plant growing along the edge of the dunes, the base of the dunes. Immediately you realize that this is a different plant. This is a different species that hasn't been recorded before. So it's fascinating that for such a small island that has been studied so much for so long, that even as of this year, still finding things, species that have been overlooked, that haven't been recorded. And as we keep finding species like this, we're also going to start finding more endemic species that don't exist anywhere but on Sable Island. Now, I don't think Sable Island is unique in this. I think that I'm sure that, for instance, if a person adopts a stretch of riverbank and they visit it and they stick with it for years and become very familiar with it, that the same experiences are possible, finding new things. And the other thing that's quite exciting is that though many of the things that I've shown you here weren't actually part of a planned research project where you have a question and you work out the way to answer that question, but you find things that are answers to things that you didn't even know you needed to ask. And so that's the two-sided sense of discovery on Sable Island. This is a photograph in the Nova Scotia Museum where all those jars on that counter are filled with things that I collected on Sable. Obviously, it's a wealth of specimens, but it's also a high rate of murdering invertebrates on Sable Island, which I do give some thought to. So I'm about to conclude. and I seem to be on time. This is a photograph of the Sable Island Station, and it was built, as you can see, in 1944, and the Sable Station was owned and operated by the Meteorological Service of Canada up until 2013. The Meteorological Service of Canada was there only to collect weather data, but because they were the only year-round government presence on the island, they represented the Queen, they represented the Canadian government on Sable Island, and they did far more than what their actual mandate. In everything that I've shown you, all the research that I've done, all the research that anybody else has done in the last 60 years would not have been possible without the Met Service on the island. In fact, now that it probably wouldn't have become a park if the Met Service hadn't already had a presence on the island. And as you can see, the bottom line there, what the Sable Island Station has provided, this year-round human presence, it addressed the concerns and responsibilities of a wide range of government departments, both provincial and federal. It ensured, it reinforced our sovereignty, our sovereignty, and the 200-mile limit, because we had a huge bulge to our 200-mile limit because of Sable being so far offshore. And you can see, wow, just like that. If we didn't have Sable, it would be a lot closer to the mainland. But also enabled for search and rescue, supported search and rescue, a helicopter refueling facility on the island, obviously monitoring and research. It provided stewardship, even though environmental protection and environmental regulations on the island weren't its responsibility. The Met Service, by setting an example and also coming up with guidelines for operations, ensured protection of the environment and also protected the heritage and culture values of Sable Island. And so, as of December 2013, Sable Island is now a national park. You can't pick cranberries anymore without a permit. Nor can you harvest scallops that wash ashore on a regular basis anymore without a permit. So there's a lot of things you can't eat on Sable Island anymore unless you have a permit. But it's a new era for the island, and it's a transition period from with parks working out what kind of buildings they're going to have on Sable, and working out how visitation will be handled. The one thing I should point out, though, is that while there are some concern about the park was that the people would start flooding to Sable Island, and there would be tourists, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there has always been tourism to Sable Island. Since the 1800s, tourists have been going to Sable Island. That's nothing new. And there were also expedition vessels coming to Sable Island. During the last 30 years, expedition vessels have come to Sable. So the expedition vessels that came to Sable last year weren't something new with Parks Canada. But the thing is, the island will never be flooded with tourists because it's incredibly difficult and very expensive to get to, unless you happen to have a fishing boat, and which has happened on a couple of occasions, and the fishermen have sort of anchored offshore and swum to the island, and then wanted to know if there was a boat on the island so they could get back to their boat. But mostly, it's expensive to get to the island, whether you have your own boat, whether you charter a flight, or whether you come by expedition vessels. So that one thing will prevent the island from being overrun by tourists. But in any case, even if it was a possibility for it being overrun by tourists, Parks Canada doesn't permit that to happen. So Sable Island, in terms of environmental conservation and protection, is in good hands now with Parks Canada. So that's it. Thank you.
We have a few moments left in this time slot, so if anybody has any questions about Sable Island or anything else.
We used to drill offshore Sable Island, but are there any remnants left from the old drilling operations?
On island, there aren't, well, there's nothing visible. In let's say, 1980s, late 1980s, a mobile crew came to the island to close off all the wellheads that were left on Sable and to permanently shut them down. And everything on the West Spit and at the more inland site has all been covered by sand and dunes. If you were you actually on the island? So you remember the area where they were drilling on the West Spit was a long, bare spit of sand. It's now a long, completely vegetated dune system. The sandwort, a plant called sandwort that can tolerate saltwater overwash, got established on the spit, and the beach grass moved in, and then beach pea. So now that entire area is one huge rolling landscape of dunes, and in the summer there's so much vegetation out there that in the summer you can see as many as 100 horses grazing on the spit. So it's totally changed, and there's no sign whatsoever of the on-island activities.
I was just wondering, there are no predators at all? Like no coyotes have made it there, no polar bears come out?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned polar bears. No, but it's something that we have thought of every now and then when occasionally, not very often, some rafts of ice do kind of get beached up on the north side, and there have been things on the ice like dead deer, and we have wondered, what our status would be if a polar bear came ashore on the island. I guess we just have to be able to run faster than the fastest seal. But in terms of native mammals, the only mammals on the island are the horses. They're the only terrestrial mammals. There are no rodents. Rabbits had been deliberately introduced in the 1970s and even earlier on both occasions so that people on the island could entertain themselves shooting rabbits. But they didn't persist, at least the second time they didn't persist. And there were rodents on the island during the life-saving station days when they had barns and were keeping feed for animals. But once they were no longer storing feed for animals and keeping livestock, the rodents and the rats and mice all disappeared. So the horses are the only terrestrial mammals, the seals are the only marine mammals. And so the horses share the environment then with birds and invertebrates and fish in the ponds.
Are there any indications of the old shipwrecks on the island? Here are the lands.
No. Many of the shipwrecks would have occurred on the far ends, on the tips of the island, the spits, which are very dynamic, and those that occurred along the sides of the length of the island frequently beached on the bars along the island. Although there are photographs of some ships, well, what would happen? They'd hit the bars, and then because they were there, the sand would then accumulate around them, so that you could actually walk out to the wrecks. There's nothing now visible. There's a couple of fragments sticking up off the north side of the island from a shipwreck called the Manhasset, which would have been, I think, the most recent one. That would have been in 1947. It was a steel vessel, so some bits and pieces you can still see. But other than that, the only time you see any sign of shipwreck are after some big seas or a big storm when a section of wooden hull with copper sheathing and big copper spikes and things washes up on the beach temporarily and then gets buried again. So not much to see. Jacques Cousteau came to Sable Island in the early 1980s with the Calypso, and he was very disappointed because he came to Sable expecting to see a lot of shipwrecks, and he was clearly disappointed. He was miffed. He left. He came for a week and left in a snit, really, after 2 days. He wasn't very friendly. His crew were great, but Jacques Cousteau himself was a bit not friendly.
Why no wind turbines, and does Amazon deliver?
Amazon will deliver to MSC headquarters in Dartmouth, and then someone will have to go out to the airport in a car and take stuff out to the airplane. But there are wind turbines on Sable. They were a bit of a disappointment, not so much because they weren't working. They're working well, but there were some technical glitches at the station end of things with inverters. And so the turbines are generating, they were capable of generating about a third of the island's electrical needs. Parks Canada, however, has decided not to keep them, so the turbines are going to be taken down and moved to another location, another Met Service location, where they can be used to power another station. But they were certainly very effective. But then, of course, you had the problem of birds. One of the little glitches that slowed the project a bit was terns which of course are fairly sort of a vulnerable species in some area. And because Sable is a migratory bird sanctuary, birds are protected. So, and terns like to perch on things, particularly on Sable. And so when the turbines were set up, the terns, when they were beginning to set up the turbines and they were setting up the towers and the guidelines and everything, and during the tern nesting season, the terns turned up and saw all this great stuff to sit on, and essentially established a colony of a nesting colony in the turbine site. Well, of course, Canadian Wildlife Service got kind of upset about that. So there was a bit of a delay in getting the turbines going, and the delay because of the terns moving into the site and getting the technology set up and the station, and that was partly the cause of the problems at the station end of things with the inverters. It's a long-winded story and could be the subject of a whole presentation, but essentially what happened was, over the years that there was a delay trying to figure out what to do about these terns and how to mitigate any bird strike mortality, the company that was actually providing the inverters for the system went out of business, and that created a whole lot of other problems. So they're terrific turbines, great turbines, Berge turbines, and they were designed for using an isolated post. So, for instance, they can be lowered and raised on a winch. So, in fact, a couple of people with a good anchor and a winch can lower them and do maintenance on them. But and they were perfect for Sable, except for that problem. Yes, I have had an apartment all this time because I had to have when I wasn't on Sable, which for the most of the time was only maybe 2 months a year, but I still needed a place where I could have keep specimens, work while I was here. I had to have a freezer. I still have maybe I won't say this because I live in the apartment below Roy. So I'll skip the details about the freezer. But anyway, yes, I did need to maintain an apartment in Halifax.
So, did you any further information on the education?
Oh yes, one of the things myself and a group of colleagues are working on. It's a slow project. It's very ambitious. We're setting up a Sable Island Institute. It's not a research institute, as in science. It's an institute that's going to bring together culture, history, arts, and sciences, and everything about Sable Island, both, and it will have a huge component in terms of public outreach, exhibitry, and education. For the many people who will never be able to visit Sable Island, this would be a gateway to the island. And for the many people who live outside of HRM, in schools in rural Nova Scotia, and we hope to expand eventually when we get up to speed. But we want to be able to build modular exhibits and train interpreters and people experts that can go out to schools in rural areas of the province who tend to have less access to these kinds of activities, and also to other areas in the Maritimes, and bring Sable Island. And the thing is, you can see Sable Island because it's so rich, because it's so interesting, particularly for children, particularly with balloons, for example. You can talk a lot about environmental issues and history and whatnot by using Sable Island as the string along which to thread a whole number of subjects. And so that's our goal.
So if any of the clubs are interested in the future in district bonds or something, maybe that's something to do with education to children. So she's going to stay till lunchtime, so catch her if you want to talk to her.
Your presentation was so inspiring, and as I listened to you, I wondered, at what point did it go from being an interest to a passion? Was there a story?
Well, it would have been the first day. The first day in 1971, as soon as I stepped off the aircraft and realized where I was. You know, I wasn't just in the pasture looking at a bunch of horses.
What happened to you?
I just became fascinated by it. Initially, I just wanted to be there, just to be there. But then, becoming more and more interested, I started asking questions. And as I said, you see some things, and they sort of give you an answer to something you didn't know you had a question about. And so basically it became a constant discovery, and I realized that, I mean, it's so compelling being in a place where you're learning things directly, rather than reading about it in a book, but going out on the dunes and, wow, that's interesting. And I would say that even now, after 40 years, and that's a total of about 9,000 days on Sable Island, because I wasn't, of course, there full years, but that was quite a lot of time spent on the island. That even now, when I am out on the dunes or out on the beach doing something, I still have these moments of like, wow, wow, that's incredible. And it can be in a little bit of information or scene. And I think that Sable is a special place because there's so much opportunity for that. But I think you could find the same thing anywhere if you can get out into the natural world and just have access to it and repeated access to a place that isn't kind of complicated by a lot of human activity and interference.
Anyway, in another year or so, I think Zoe will get to like the island.
It's growing on me.
I thought it was a coincidence, Zoe, when you came off the island, and every time you came off the island, there was a strange smell in my apartment. And so now I know what it is. Seal meat, yeah. Anyway, your talk is, as you can see from all the questions and the rapt attention that you've received, it's been a very interesting talk that you gave us this morning. Who would think that sand dunes would be so interesting and so educational? So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very much. I have this token of my appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.